Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. I'm going to apologize in advance for my voice. That's what 3 weeks of IMO meetings can do to some people. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it is a real pleasure to welcome you today at this joint COP28 side event on the 2023 IMO GHG Strategy, which of course is defining the global level playing field for shipping decarbonization. And we're very pleased to co-host this very timely event again with our colleagues and friends from UNCTAD and IRENA. And of course, this follows the very successful event that we hosted last year in Sharm el-Sheikh. Cooperation across the UN family is very dear to me, and multilateralism is key to providing an adequate response to the global climate change. Addressing climate change is a priority at IMO, and that was demonstrated last July through the unanimous adoption of the 2023 IMO GHG Strategy. And IMO member states significantly reinforced their commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping sector. The 2023 IMO strategy foresees reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by or around 2050, taking into account different national circumstances. The strategy also defines the reduction pathways towards net zero, namely by reducing emissions by at least 20%, striving for 30% by 2030, and by at least 70%, striving to 80% by 2040. And in view of the climate urgency, the strategy foresees that by 2030, at least 5% of the energy used by the global shipping fleet should comprise of zero or net zero or near zero fuels and technologies, which will drive the action in this decade. IMO's strength lays in defining a global regulatory framework for safe, secure, and sustainable shipping that is fair, effective, universally adopted, implemented, and enforced. Accordingly, IMO has initiated concrete work on developing a basket of mid-term GHG reduction measures. We will ensure that the GHG reduction requirements in the 2023 strategy will be met. IMO member states agree that these measures will be adopted in the autumn of 2025 and enter into force in 2027. So quite a challenging period, but as usual, IMO always delivers. In close collaboration with our colleagues from UNCTAD and IMO and IRENA, IMO is currently assessing the impact on the global fleet, on world trade, and on states of concrete proposals for measures that will require the gradual reduction of GHG intensity of marine fuels in combination with a global maritime greenhouse gases emission pricing mechanism. The impact assessment will look into how international shipping can continue to play its pivotal role for global trade, for connecting people, and ensuring access to the world's market for all of us in a just and equitable way, whilst ensuring a clear course to net zero shipping. Today, we will hear from our colleagues from UNCTAD and IRENA government representatives and stakeholders what their expectations and contributions to the development of the next set of IMO global reductions measures are. Time is limited for lengthy discussions on such a hugely important task, but what is clear is that cross-sectorial cooperation across the maritime value chain is key to success. So without further ado, I welcome you once more and look forward to today's discussions and future collaboration. Thank you very much.
Your Excellencies, colleagues from the International Maritime Organization and the International Renewable Energy Agency, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Our maritime transport system is the lifeblood of the global economy, facilitating over 80% 20% of the world's trade volume. Yet, this vital sector also contributes to nearly 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. As seaborne trade has grown, emissions have escalated by 20% in just the past decade, a trajectory we simply cannot afford to continue. Our message today, here at the COP, is very clear. Bold global action is necessary to decarbonize shipping. However, to do this effectively, we must engage with all stakeholders in the shipping industry to ensure that decarbonization is just, fair, and equitable. We know decarbonization will not be cheap. Our review of Maritime Transport 2023 echoes previous estimates that up to $28 billion will be required annually to decarbonize ships by 2050. And a staggering $90 billion per year will be needed for infrastructure development of carbon-neutral fuels by the same deadline. Put simply, if decarbonization efforts are not accompanied by economic growth, sound multilateral regulation, and technological innovation, there is a risk that it will leave behind in the short term exactly those countries that it stands to help the most in the long run. To better align the GHG emission reduction targets set by IMO, the shipping industry also requires certainty and clear economic incentives to decarbonize. Ship owners are facing a dilemma. Either renew the fleet now while lacking clarity about future rules, fuels, and technologies, or wait until the alternative fuel pathways and regulations are clearer. The good news is that despite the infancy of this transition, with 99% of the global fleet still reliant on conventional fuels, there is hope. 21% of new vessels on order are designed for alternative fuels, setting the stage for a new era. This underscores the importance of system-wide collaboration, swift regulatory interventions, and robust investments in green technologies and fleets to make this transition work. This underlines a basic truth. Shipping cannot decarbonize on its own. It requires action across the entire ecosystem, involving shipping and the energy sector. Ports will need to invest heavily in port cargo handling equipment, storage facilities, and replace or construct new terminals. Similarly, boat and port crews will need upskilling to handle ships running on alternative fuels and green onboard ship technologies. There is a potential for developing countries to tap the renewable energy resources and contribute to the future fuel market. Our technical assistance project on sustainable smart ports, piloting the case for countries of Mauritius, Morocco, and Ghana, will produce a methodology that will help ports accelerate their transition efforts in a way that is win-win for all parties involved. At the same time, UNCTAD is bringing to the COP a very important call for a universal regulatory framework applicable to all ships, regardless of their flags or ownership. Economic incentives such as levies or contributions tied to emissions can accelerate the transition by making alternative fuels more competitive and using the funds to invest and ensure that transport costs do not harm the most vulnerable economies. We hope that conversations like this can garner momentum in this very important mission. In closing, allow me to thank once more our partners at IMO and IRENA, who are our greatest allies in this collective effort. Your Excellencies, the cost of inaction is very high. We do not have the luxury of time. The maritime industry is at a crossroads, and we cannot afford to hesitate. Thank you.
Can I now call to the stage Mr. Francesco Dagan?
Buongiorno. Good morning, everyone. So, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this event, which we prepare together with our colleagues from the International Maritime Organization and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. In the last few months, 130 countries has agreed to triple renewable energy capacity and double energy efficiency by 2030. And most probably, by the end of COP28, this will become a global target. For this reason, I would like, first of all, to emphasize that the shipping sector plays a key role as enabler of energy transition through its cargo vessel and port. As we strive to meet this target, it is essential that we address the emissions produced by this sector and take immediate actions to achieve net zero shipping or risk delaying the transition. The new IMO Greenhouse Gas Strategy that was adopted earlier this year and was just mentioned is a great first step toward this goal. I'd like to congratulate the IMO and its members for achieving this. As we discussed earlier this year in IRENA's Ministerial Roundtable on decarbonizing the shipping sector during our assembly, governments are set to play a critical role in making this happen. Regulation and policies remain the key driver for the decarbonization of the sector. Having said that, I cannot emphasize enough the role of international and cross-sectoral cooperation. This is a challenge that can only be solved if everyone collaborates toward the same goal. The decarbonization of the shipping sector relies heavily on renewable energy, and the challenge ahead is sizable. Our World Energy Transition Outlook estimates that by 2050, the shipping sector will require 7.5 exajoules of sustainable fuels, including biofuels and e-fuels, such as green methanol and ammonia. To put this into context, achieving this demand for e-fuels will require the supply of over 60 million tons of green hydrogen annually, equivalent to roughly two-thirds of today's total hydrogen supply. At the same time, this would require the deployment of 600 gigawatts of electrolyzer and 1.2 terawatts of renewable capacity to sustain them. This equates to roughly $1.8 trillion US dollars, and as I've been said, that means 62 billion US dollars annually until 2050. And that is excluding the shipside investment. With that said, the time to act, as we have been listening many times in this environment, is now. We need to play in large-scale deployment of additional renewable energy generation, electricity generation, close to the ports, to produce the green hydrogen and fuels needed by the sector. At IRENA, we are already working with our members on these efforts. and we look forward to continue to collaborate with you and other partners to advance the decarbonization of the international shipping. Collaboration is the only instrument we have if we wish to achieve a sustainable and carbon neutral future for the industry. Grazie molte. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Francesco. Gracias, Arsenio. Gracias, Rebecca. I think with that great introduction of our partners within the UN family and as a great example of intergovernmental cooperation in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, we can now move to the first panel, and I would like to invite our distinguished speakers, government representatives, to the podium under the moderation of Ms. Johanna Christensen, the CEO of the Global Maritime Forum. So, Mr. Mark Harbers, Minister of Infrastructure and Water Management of the Netherlands, please. Ms. Ragnhild Sjoer-Sierstad, State Secretary to the Minister of Climate and Environment of Norway, please. Ambassador Alban Ishoda, the Presidential Envoy for Shipping of the Marshall Islands, and Mr. Avinash Persaud, the Special Envoy to the Prime Minister on Investment and Financial Services of Barbados.
Thank you, Roel. Is this on? Yeah, okay, good. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the introduction, Roel. Excellencies. Well, allow me maybe briefly, what's the purpose of this panel now and these statements, and briefly introduce myself as well. My name is Johanna Christensen. I'm the CEO of the Global Maritime Forum. In 2019, we launched the Getting to Zero Coalition, which is an alliance of stakeholders from across the maritime spectrum, everything from ports, shipping companies, banks, government institutions, and many other entities from across the maritime spectrum who've been working together to make zero-emission shipping a scalable reality by 2030, with the end objective of full decarbonization by 2050 at the latest. What we have seen since the establishment of the Getting to Zero Coalition in 2019 is a tremendous amount of momentum build up. And we've really seen the sector move from being, if we're being honest, a climate laggard to a climate leader, one that is focused on bringing solutions to market, on moving fast and at scale, even in these early stages of the transition. But of course, this needs support. It needs a framework, a common rule sets by which we all operate, and that's why we're here today. And in particular, we've seen many first movers make significant investments in fuels, in ships, and other parts of this ecosystem that needs to transition in anticipation of this global rule set developing. I'm so excited that we have this distinguished set of, or this distinguished group of policymakers and here to help us go through and talk about the various challenges and opportunities that have already been outlined by our introductory speakers. So without further ado, perhaps I may go to Minister Mark Harbers first, Minister of Infrastructure and Water Management of the Netherlands. If I can start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. At first, let me thank IMO, UNCTAD and IRENA for organizing this event on shipping. It's a very relevant topic for a climate conference because 90% of international trade goes by sea, and shipping is a major driver of the global economy. But the sector also accounts for nearly 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And take in mind that only 4 countries have higher emissions. So the sector also has a responsibility to contribute to climate goals. So I welcome the growing effort to make shipping more sustainable, ensuring a just and equitable transition. The Netherlands believes that these are global issues that need to be addressed primarily at IMO level. A prime example of this cooperation was the adoption of the 2023 IMO Greenhouse Gas Strategy in July this year. It was, I think, a turning point in the history of international shipping, opening the door to a sustainable future. Ladies and gentlemen, the Netherlands is a strong supporter of a net zero emission ambition. To achieve that ambition, we need, first, a combination of pricing and regulation to start the necessary transition to sustainable fuels in a cost-effective way, while minimizing the unintended negative impacts of these measures on IMO member states. Second, we need a just and equitable transition that leaves no one behind. And third, we need to adhere to the strict timelines set out in the strategy for the agreement, adoption and entry into force of the measures. So one of the key conditions is a transition to scalable, sustainable fuels. Considering the long operating life of ships and the time needed to increase production capacity of sustainable fuels, it's clear that the transition must start in this decade. We're convinced that a combination of pricing in the form of a levy and regulation in the form of global fuel standards is essential for bringing about this transition in the global maritime industry. A global fuel standard will enable the industry to reach net zero by 2050, coupled with a flexibility mechanism so that industry players can progress at different speeds while keeping the environmental integrity of the measure intact. A global levy on greenhouse gas emissions will also help the sector meet the 2030 reduction targets. This levy will provide incentives for an energy-efficient operation of ships. It also will encourage parties that take the lead, stimulate early investment, and ensure that no country is left behind in the transition. I look forward to the outcome of the comprehensive impact assessment. I think it will help us design measures that are cost-effective and have the least possible negative impacts on countries. And it's also important to listen to UNCTAD and other organizations that underline that the cost of inaction will prove to be much higher. Each year we wait will increase the burden, and the most vulnerable will then be hit hardest. So I trust that IMO and all the parties to IMO will do the right thing. Let's open the door to a new, sustainable future of shipping. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I wonder if I could ask you an additional question, which is, there's been quite some focus here at COP on the establishment of maritime green corridors as a way of unlocking first-mover action and testing solutions at scale. And indeed, Dutch ports, including the Port of Rotterdam, have played a big role in this already. What's your view on how states and ports in the Global South can be involved in this?
Yeah, I think for the energy transition of maritime shipping, for instance, green corridors can be particularly important in piloting and demonstrating new technologies. They can fulfill a stimulating role in spurring the early adoption and thus the necessary early start of the transition. As one of the signatories of the Clyde Bank Declaration, we are committed to developing green corridors. For example, we financially support the maritime industry with innovative projects to realize around 30 zero-emission ships in operation by 2033. It's our maritime master plan for 210 million euro. And we facilitate feasibility studies for a green corridor to the UK, and our ports are also involved in corridors to, for instance, Sweden. And in the Netherlands, we also have examples of corridors involving the private sector in both the Global South and the Global North. For instance, the partnership between the ports of Rotterdam and Pechem in Brazil on acceleration of offshore wind energy and green hydrogen production, and on port development, logistics and hinterland connections. but also the cooperation between the Port of Amsterdam and partners from the international energy sector on exploring a green hydrogen export corridor between the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and the Port of Amsterdam. So to realize the energy transition with growing global demand for clean energy, the huge potential for the production of green energy in the southern hemisphere will play a very important role. And I therefore foresee an increasing role for states and ports in the global south. So to conclude, global cooperation and private sector involvement are both important for making the fuel transition in the maritime sector just and equitable, which remains our goal.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Alban Ishoda, if I may come to you next, Presidential Special Envoy for Shipping from the Marshall Islands. You are in a particular position because you're not only, of course, one of the largest flag states, but also as such, play a key role in the IMO negotiations. If you would kick us off with your broader views first.
Thank you, Joanna. Excellencies, Minister, good morning. My last COP was in 2012. I promised myself that I would never come to these things, but here we are. I find that there's a lot of discussions going around in these platform or in these spaces, but I quite enjoy the discussions that we have in IMO because it's more practical and pragmatic. And I just wanted to put it out there. So I look forward to the next rounds of discussions. In July of this year, the International Maritime Organization adopted the 2023 revised strategy. And the interim targets aimed at achieving the 1.5 degree Celsius agenda are now within reach. The Marshall Islands, along with six-pack plus, not a beer, not a combination of drinks, but 6 Pacific countries that have come together to create an alliance, which is growing, by the way, as included members from the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, and other LDC members from Africa. Tirelessly advocated for substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, for an ambitious carbon price, and for an equitable transition to be adopted within the 2023 strategy at the IMO. However, regrettably, we did not receive the support we had anticipated, given the urgency of decarbonizing the international shipping sector. Despite the challenges we faced, we accepted the interim targets as a step in the right direction, recognizing their potential to bring us closer to the critical 1.5 degree temperature goal. Nonetheless, it is crucial to emphasize that these targets, while a positive development, fall short of what is truly necessary. 1.5 remains technically within reach, but there is a lot of detail missing. There is as yet no assurance for the climate most vulnerable states how their needs will be prioritized in practice, and no definition for the levy we all know is needed, or how revenues will be used. Major progress on these matters must be demonstrated at MEPC 81 if the most vulnerable of the states are to continue to have faith in the process. The Marshall Islands remains committed to the cause of combating climate change and ensuring a sustainable future for our planet. We urge the international community to recognize the magnitude of the climate crisis and the need for more ambitious measures within the maritime industry. The urgency of our collective action cannot be overstated, and we must continue to press for deeper cuts in greenhouse gas emissions to safeguard our environment and future generations. The Marshall recognizes the paramount importance of establishing a comprehensive global rule set to address greenhouse gas emissions within the shipping industry. We believe that a unified and consistent framework is essential to effectively combat climate change on a global scale. For this reason, the Marshall Islands are calling for all states and stakeholders to adopt not a piecemeal regional, but a wide global collaborative approach, which is the only approach truly able to achieve meaningful reductions in GHG emissions from shipping. To that end, the Marshall Islands cannot stress enough how critical it is that absolute transparency and fair and equitable process is adopted at the IMO. The Marshall Islands is committed to actively engaging in discussions and negotiations to ensure the development and implementation of these critical regulations. We also acknowledge the pivotal role that a universal mandatory levy, which is science-based proposition, can play in compelling the maritime industry to reduce its carbon footprint. To eliminate any uncertainty regarding the GHG pricing mechanism, let us emphatically state our active advocacy for the implementation of a universal mandatory levy, with a firm entry price set at a minimum of 150 per ton CO2 emissions as we approach MEPC 81. While recognizing the challenges associated with implementing a levy, we are committed to exploring innovative solutions and collaborating with international partners to ensure a just and equitable transition to reach the 1.5 degrees agenda so that no one is left behind. But I must also state, we must see real determined action. We are extremely happy to see UNCTAD commit to a levy as a logical economic measure. Now we need to see other major players, including our friends in Europe and the West, do likewise. We need to see real definition as to how we are given the effect to an equitable transition. We need to see commitment to ensuring our states at the sharp edge of this emergency are not penalized economically for the measures we all know shipping must take. There is no further headroom for ambiguity. The deepening climate crisis simply doesn't allow it. The Marshall Islands acknowledges that implementing the 2023 IMO GHG revised strategy presents both challenges and opportunities for our nation. As a low-lying atoll nation vulnerable to impacts of climate change, we are acutely aware of the urgency to reduce GHG emissions and mitigate the associated risk. However, we also recognize the potential economic opportunities that can arise from green shipping practices, including the development of sustainable shipping technologies and the enhancement of our maritime service sector. We are committed to harnessing these opportunities while addressing the challenges to ensure a sustainable and prosperous future for our people and our planet. Small and isolated as we are, our Pacific states are committed to maintaining the voice of the highest possible ambition at IMO. Please join us. Komodada.
Thank you, Alvin. I wonder whether I may dig a little deeper into one of the points that you made. You said that Europe and Marshall Islands are at the sharp edge of this crisis and really faced with an existential risk, actually. And I wonder how you think about this balance between this risk and the long-term sustainability needs, and then the ability to uphold a sector on which you also depend for the flow of goods, essential goods, in fact. Can you expand a little on that?
Sure. So just given the time, let me just try to be brief.
Very shortly.
As one of the largest registry in the world, we depend heavily on this sector for our revenue generation. What we also recognize is that having a flag without a country does not really mean anything. It is a balance. It is a fine balance that we have to do, and it's unprecedented. And I think at this point in time, with the appetite that we've seen in IMO, there is a lot of interest to progress what needs to happen. And the Marshall Islands recognize its role as a large registry, but also as a vulnerable country. And we believe that we have a moral obligation to lead on ambition, but we also have a responsibility as a large registry. So we will continue to try and balance both, and we welcome partnership from everyone to see how we can move this forward together, ensuring that no one is left behind.
Thank you, Alvin. Avinash Perso, you're the Special Envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados on Investment and Financial Services. May I add that you are deep, deep, deep in the weeds and have been a key architect behind some of the efforts that are underway from your government on multilateral finance reform through the Bridgetown Initiative. I think that adds a really interesting perspective on this discussion that we're now having around pricing emissions from international shipping. Perhaps you could share with us your sort of perspectives on what that might look like.
Sure, and thank you very much for inviting me. This is not a forum I normally speak at, and I'm very grateful. And I thank UNCTAD, IMO, and IRENA. And I also want to salute the Marshall Islands for navigating a very fine balance. We in Barbados considered their position and fully support it, but recognize it's a brave position for a small island that's quite remote, as many small islands are. Now, especially as this is the first time I'm speaking with you, I have a choice of being either polite and pretend that there isn't a gorilla in the room, or I could shed a light on the gorilla in the room. Because the reality is that the reason why shipping emissions was in the Paris Global Pact, the reason why shipping emissions is in the International Tax Committee, it's just been launched by France and Kenya, the reason why Mia Mottley referred to shipping emissions levies in the opening of COP is not just about decarbonizing the industry. And that's been the entire focus, to the exception of the Marshall Islands intervention that we've heard so far. And that makes perfect sense. It's perfectly understandable that the industry should rightly focus on that. We do need to decarbonize the industry. It is important and it is urgent. 3% of global emissions sounds small, but are significant, very significant. We need to do this quickly. Of course, there are many ways you could decarbonize. You could decarbonize without a levy, without a tax, without a carbon price. We have got rid of harmful pollutants in the past through bans sometimes. But incentives, by creating costs and taxes, is a fairly effective way. You know, there's the most wonderful book on cancer called about the biography of cancer. Talks about the fact that what really killed lung cancer wasn't medical advice, it was the taxes. So taxes can play a very important role. And there may be a happy confluence that by raising a tax on emissions, we will incentivize the decarbonization and we will raise revenues. And there may be an even happier confluence that these revenues may exceed what it actually costs to decarbonize. Because to incentivize the decarbonization, we want to create something that really changes behavior. But the actual cost of decarbonizing, especially with new technologies, may not be as great as the revenues being collected. And therefore, there may be the possibility of using those revenues for things related to the fact that the industry has contributed to emissions, like loss and damage in climate-vulnerable countries. And, of course, a loss and damage fund has just been established, so that also really brings many of these issues to the fore in a way that they weren't there a couple of years ago. But it would be a very happy confluence of that to actually occur. And it's not at all clear that that will be the case. Now, why should we be thinking of the shipping industry as a place to be raising revenues in addition to decarbonizing, but also for addressing loss and damage or more global issues? And that's because the shipping industry is not just an industry, it is one business activity. It is critical to something that touches almost all of our international economic activity, 90% of trade. So if you think about UNITAID, and that is the model one should be thinking about. UNITAID has spent $2.5 billion on tuberculosis, malaria, and AIDS, and had a substantial global impact, and it has raised a majority of its money through a levy on passengers traveling on the airlines. Nothing to do with the airlines, nothing to do with changing airline behavior. It's to do with a global phenomena, and what we're doing is we are putting a levy on a global activity. We've got a global public good, a global problem, and we're putting a levy on global activity. And if anything, shipping activity is even more global. I think the thing we would be, it's very important to do, is firstly to make sure that the industry benefits from any levy, that the revenues go first to the industry to make sure it decarbonizes, but that we're also raising money to reflect a global economic activity generating revenues for a global problem and that needs global solutions. Now, one of the challenges is to make sure that taxes are not regressive, are not harmful. To me, that's not about not having a tax, that's about how you design the tax. And so the International Tax Committee is going to be sitting there designing a tax on emissions in aviation and shipping. And I would recommend that you, as an industry, as the IMO, beyond the industry, as all of those involved, all the stakeholders in shipping, consider advice to give to that committee on design issues. Because, I mean, when the Marshall Islands first put forward the idea, I have to say my initial reaction was caution, because I didn't want to have a tax on trade. I didn't want to have, because trade is good for the global economy. I didn't want to have a tax on remoteness, because we need trade in remote places. Remote places are most dependent on trade. And it was the Marshall Islands' bravery and courage that made us think deeply about the fact that this is a major global activity and we have a global problem that needs a global solution. And what I would like to end with is to say to you that there are discussions going ahead, and it'll be very important for us to hear you on your knowledge and expertise on what is the best design of those levies that have the most minimal impact on trade, that is the fairest, most progressive way of creating revenues for a global problem from a global activity. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Avinash. I feel a bit like this is a topic we could spend the rest of the hour discussing, to be totally frank. And thank you so much for pointing to the gorilla in the room. Thank you so much for that. Allow me to move on to Ragnhild Syrstel. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. State Secretary to the Minister of Climate and Environment of Norway. And of course, Norway has a long experience of using regulation to affect change in its shipping sector, to decarbonize its shipping sector domestically and Norwegian flagged ships. Perhaps you can share a little of your experience in this regard.
Thank you. Thank you to the IMO UNCTAD and IRENA for hosting this event. It's nice to get a brief glance of all the practical work that's been done at the IMO here at COP. So, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the climate deal reached at the IMO on the 7th of July this year was a landmark agreement outlining an ambitious pathway for bringing shipping to net zero. This climate deal is not only important for shipping and the IMO, it is an inspiration for COP28 and the wider cooperation on increased actions to cut climate emissions. The IMO climate deal inspires because of its content. Yes, it is ambitious, but the totality of the deal also captures the need for a just and equitable transition and careful assessment and consideration of possible impacts of the forthcoming emissions reductions measures. The IMO climate deal also inspires because how it was reached. And it was reported to me by those involved that the dialogue and interaction between member states from the various corners of the world, having different concerns, needs and interests, were excellent. I'm hopeful that this excellent example of global cooperation will be maintained in the follow-up process and be a key factor for continued success at the IMO. So where do we go from here? I don't think it's my role right now to, at this juncture, to point out the detailed content of the basket of measures. And as pointed out at the IMO GHG strategy, it should compromise both a technical and economic element and needs to deliver on the reduction targets. I will underline, though, that it is of utmost importance to meet the agreed timeline and to ensure adoption of measures in the autumn of 2025 and develop compromises which keeps all on board. In addition to take active part in the ongoing follow-up work at the IMO, Norway nourishes decarbonization through taking action at home to deploy zero-emission solutions in domestic shipping and through supporting developing countries to ensure that all can take part in the transition to zero-emission shipping. Those two streams of action are important for the IMO to succeed on the task to take shipping to net zero. The zero-emission solutions which are now already on board ships operating in Norway, and also the further development of solutions on the ships in the order book and through several pilot projects will be important for the global shipping. And when it comes to pricing, as you asked, we have now expanded the ETS European Trading Scheme for carbon trading involving shipping, and there was also a carbon price in Norway heading towards 2,000 kroner in 2030. So we have a specific pathway pricing carbon tax in Norway. And our domestic actions are not only developing technical solutions, but also develop an early market for batteries, green hydrogen, and green ammonia. It can therefore be claimed that such domestic actions will support and lubricate the process at international arena as well. Our actions to support developing countries in their transition to low and zero emission shipping is of course important to build a sustainable economy in developing countries. But it is also an important part of bringing global shipping to net zero. Ports in developing countries have the largest cargo volume throughput. Developing countries and building ships, fuel ships, manning ships, and the list goes on. All in all, now is the time to support developing countries in order to enable net zero in global shipping by or around 2050. Therefore, Norway this autumn enhanced our support to the IMO project Green Voyage 2050 with a total of $19 million for the period of 2024 to 2030. So, to conclude, the IMO brought a landmark climate deal to COP28. Norway will do our utmost to ensure that the IMO can report successful follow-up actions to future COP meetings. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ragnhild. I think what some people in this room know is that Norway has played this incredibly important role in brokering agreements in really complex IMO negotiations over the past many, many years. And I'm glad to hear that you'll continue to play that role. I think that's appreciated by everyone here. With that, I think our time is very much up, and I will pass the word back to Roel.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you very much, Excellencies, for your extremely interesting insights. I'm already looking forward to the next intersessional working group on greenhouse gases and the next MEPC meeting in March to continue these discussions. Thank you, Joanna, for keeping everyone condensed and to the point, because we have another panel, and that is a panel providing industry perspectives on the discussions and particularly the development of the greenhouse gas reduction measures by the IMO. Jan Hofmann doesn't need any further introduction. Our friend and colleague from UNCTAD will moderate this session, and I would like to call to the podium the following representatives: Mr. Battar, Group Executive Vice President, Maritime Policy and Government Affairs of MSC; Mr. Christoph Pautz, the Chair of Fuels and Products Working Group of IPCA, an important association providing inputs to the IMO discussions; Ms. Alicia Eastman, President of Intercontinental Energy; and last, Mr. Sam Ugur, the Director Group of Shipping of Tata Steel. So please make your way to the podium that we can continue these discussions. Thank you very much.
thank you very much. My name is Jan Hoffmann, Head of Trade Logistics at UNCTAD. I believe the slide is up. Very happy to be here to now speak with the people who will actually make it happen, no? The private sector. One thought to start with, the previous energy transitions in our industry, from rowing to wind, from wind and sorry, Gavin, I'm not excluding wind also for the next one, but
sorry, Gavin.
But rowing to wind, wind to coal, coal to oil. In the end, they were self-funded because the new technology was somehow better. The next transition, you might think, all the new fuels, excluding wind, tend to be less energy dense, more expensive, and so on. However, if we include the total cost of burning the fuel, including the external cost, then this transition should also be self-funding. And this is, I think, the challenge we have to work on. We have 4 excellent panelists. The sequence I have here, I will start with Bud, then Christophe, then Alicia, and last but not least, Sem Ugur, and you will help me with my pronunciation. But happy to see you here in Dubai. Last time I think it was New York, before it was London. Our offices are both in Geneva on 2 sides of the same lake, but always good to see you here. Dar is Group Executive Vice President, Maritime Policy and Government Affairs at MSC. And yeah, you have some opening statement and thoughts on the topic, please. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jan, and thank you to all of you for joining today. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here to discuss this topic. As I frequently remind people every chance I get, this is far and away the biggest practical and regulatory challenge that the shipping industry has ever faced, and frankly will ever face. I mean, this is existential for us. And we are in the fortunate position of having a global regulator as the IMO to regulate our industry. It really, for such a global enterprise collectively, that is not there because we just want to operate ships. We're there because trade patterns require the services. So in a sense, we are the conduit for global trade. It needs to be regulated and regulated properly on an international level. And I really congratulate governments from across the spectrum for finally, in July, coming to a proper conclusion on the 2023 IMO strategy. I wasn't sure what was going to happen, but I've got to tell you, knowing what options were available and having had a lot of experience in that space myself, working at IMO as a government delegate before I joined the private sector, it was really a remarkable feat of diplomacy. And I think the developed countries gave some, the developing countries, China being the most significant leader, gave some, and came to a conclusion now which matches up with where we needed them to be as the industry. We've been calling for a couple of years for the right answer is net zero by 2050. Well, it's great that governments now recognize that is the right end state. And we'll figure out along the way how close we can get to what happens in between. And that's largely going to be determined by fuel availability, which IMO is not going to regulate. But those are pretty sensible targets that are set out, indicative benchmarks or whatever you want to refer to them as. And it's a good start. We're on the way. Governments also need to understand clearly the industry's been calling for a couple years for a global carbon price and a mechanism to go with that. And we believe, and certainly my company believes, that a combination of a technical standard, a global fuel standard of some mechanism, details yet to be defined, but we've got a pretty good start when we look at the EU, Fuel EU regulation because they put a lot of thought into it, a good starting point, you're not starting from scratch, and an economic element to it. And I like the phrase that the distinguished delegate from Norway raised when she called it an economic element. I think it is a mistake, and it's a mistake by the industry and governments to refer to it by a name such as a levy or refer to it as a cap and trade, emission trading system. Those are very polarizing terms that probably don't reflect what this is really going to look like in the end. And if you allow those that don't want this to happen, or maybe don't want the transition to happen, to latch on to the idea of a global tax on trade rather than a mechanism to help control the pace of decarbonization of this sector and therefore global trade, and also what options are available, I think you create unnecessary political obstacles. So we welcome most of the comments that we've heard here. I will say, in closing my opening remarks here, we're in basically a two-lane race. One is the technology development to make sure we're capable of consuming the fuels efficiently on our ships and safely. And the second is the fuels themselves. In my opinion, by far, the race is being won on the technology side right now. In the end, whether or not this is all just a bunch of talk and hyperbole and statements and sound bites, will turn on, do we get the fuels? And if we get the fuels, we can make this happen. We sponsor a racing team called Team Malaysia that races by wind. Very famous sailor Boris Herman, who sent me a nice message this morning, he characterizes this as we're in a race for the planet, and this is a race we must win. I agree with Boris and Team Malaysia. This is a race we must win.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Do we applaud here also? No? Thank you. We had sent you a couple of questions, and time is a bit short. Let me focus on the second one of the questions. As MSC advocates a vessel pooling option, where the performance of a group of vessels could count instead of only the individual ship. No? And that was your CEO and others promoting this. Just yesterday, putting together some numbers and companies and ships and so on, actually, I counted in our data set from Clarkson's, there are 15,719 single ship companies among the 28,000 companies. How should they pool, or is this an incentive for further consolidation?
Yeah, so first of all, I think the number of companies that own ships is misleading because there are lots of reasons why you incorporate a group of ships or a single ship. So I don't think that's really the most accurate way to think about it. But what we had in mind is really relevant for a fuel standard or mechanisms where you might be able to make a big investment and take a lot of risk in either, say you're a two-ship company, in one ship and monitor with the other ship in the meantime, and you average out the emissions so that you don't have to take all the risk at once. And in our case, where we have a fleet of maybe 800 ships, what we would do is pick maybe 10 technologies or 10 different designs and sample them and put them out there, and we'd see which ones are actually emerging to solve the overall benefit, the overall need that we have to actually get to decarbonization. So it's really relevant for that element. I'm not so sure the economic element really is that much in play there. And going with that, I think it's also important to think about, could we, with a global fuel standard, in addition to incorporate this pooling, which is important. If you look at Fuel EU, it's not limited to your company. Smaller companies can form a consortium together and do it the most efficient way, which I think will get us farther faster. That's why we support that, as well as a date certain where you can no longer deliver a ship that can only consume fossil fuels. We need to move past that, and we think that will be a very positive step towards sending the right signals to the fuel markets, the investment markets, and also level the playing field going forward.
Thank you. Christoph Putz, Chair of Fuels and Products at the International Petroleum Industry Environmental Conservation Association, IPECA. You will also help me with my pronunciation. Your thoughts on the key topic, please.
Thank you, Jan, and good day to all, excellencies, ministers, distinguished delegates. I'm very pleased to be with you. It's an honor to be invited for this panel to discuss about the industry implication in international shipping. To start with, maybe I should briefly introduce IPECA because it's an association that is known by many here, but it's an association, it's a non-lobbying association that was created at the request of United Nations back almost 50 years ago in 1974 to get a channel of communication with global oil and gas industry. And since that time, we have been dedicated to advancing environmental and social performance across the energy transition. Our membership principles require commitments to the nature, sustainability, climate, and people aspect of the anything the members would do. We have been a long-standing observer of the IMO and contributed technically to a number of regulatory developments. And our members are supporting the Paris Agreement goals and the journey to net zero future. And with that, I may come to to the key expectations regarding these midterm candidate measures. In fact, we've got three key to introduce the subject. And I may come back to that later during the panel if there are more questions and time to do so. But we've got three key expectations. One is about the process. It was highlighted by many during the introduction in the previous panel, but we would expect a tight collaboration, a consensus-based approach under the auspices of the IMO. I think we've got a great chance to get an institution, the global institutions, able to address these global challenges. And prior experience, prior developments show the ability of the different parties of the IMO to gain consensus on development regulations. I may take as an example the IMO 2020, the sulfur cap implementation back in Jan 2020. That was a very complex and a global initiative that was successfully implemented by the IMO. And we contributed obviously to that while supporting reformulation of our product as well as developing new technologies to desulfurize the bunker fuels. So the process is key and the collaboration is key. Second, the outcome. Obviously, we are welcoming well-designed regulations. In particular, our focus is the global fuel standard. I may come back to the key features there, but in a nutshell, we would expect these regulations to provide the right predictability with durable regulations being in place, the right level of incentive, and I may come back to that. And last but not least, we are advocating for a technology neutral approach, as we consider that many options should be left open to the different players to decarbonize along the supply chain the different fuels and energies that will be used by the ships. And third, well, timing. Timing is the essence of the success. If we are willing to start impacting international shipping by 2030, there's no other choice that concluding and reaching consensus and adopting new regulation by 2025 in attempt to start deploying these alternate fuels. And obviously going beyond to get access to scalable solutions here to further increase reduce the level of emissions emitted by international shipping. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you. And the applause. Yeah, you concluded with timing. What's your realistic timeline for the IMO to reduce the carbon intensity?
Right. So, I mean, Jan, you address here one of the most critical challenges the world is facing, as at the same time, during this energy transformation, should I say, we need to supply the energies and the growing demands because of growing population, growing GDP, growing middle class, and all that is good. But at the same time, we need to reduce the level of emissions there. In the introduction, there were mentioned about some investments levels that are needed in the international shipping to decarbonize. But the bigger picture, and I'm referring here to the net zero report from the International Energy Agency, refers to more than $4 trillion per year to decarbonize the planet. So that's the level of challenges that we face collectively. And to do that, we do believe that there is a room for a healthy and a prosperous future for the planet and people and nature on it. But that needs all parties, all technologies, and all solutions to be implemented. They will all play a role. Regarding the parties, and I will start by ourselves, the oil and gas industry, we see ourselves as a key enabler to transition to new energies, thanks to our competences, our current assets, our capacity for innovation, as well as ability to attract investment for large-scale projects. We believe that we could play a lead role. And many of our members are already committed to net zero emissions levels, scope 1 and 2, some of them including scope 3 emissions, so all the fuels that are being used by our customers, to demonstrate the ability and the willingness for the industry to be with you in that journey to decarbonize the shipping sector. Obviously, we're not just by ourselves. We rely strongly on the collaboration and partnership for the deployment of these technologies going further. Obviously, in that sense, international maritime organization, yourself, as well as governments, play a very important role because we need, obviously, clear regulations to provide incentive to decarbonize the society. Regarding technologies, I mentioned already that we're looking for technology neutral solutions here to maximize the benefits of different energy sources that could be found around the globe. Again, referring to reports from the IEA or the IPCC, you could get a view that there's going to be a mix of technologies being used. Oil and gas remains, coupled with CCS, carbon capture and storage, obviously renewable energies, and we talked about that before in the introduction, will play a leading role, as well as some of the technologies and options that could turn the emissions levels negative, which is most needed, obviously, to reach a net climate neutrality with net zero emissions. And solutions, that was said in prior panel too, but we do believe that a just transition includes an understanding that the markets, the countries will decide what is best suited for their purposes. And in reality, that's going to be depending on the level of development. The challenge for Global South is different from OECD countries. Again, that was mentioned before, but it's going to be all depending on the needs for the energies, the growth of the population, as well as the level of economic.
Okay, that was my quick question about
Thank you.
timing.
I see you.
You see my...
I may have to rush. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Are you keeping the timing?
No, I'm not.
Thank you. No, thank you, Christoph. Alicia Eastman, President, Intercontinental Energy, your opening statement on your expectations on the midterm greenhouse gas reduction measures. Your expectations.
Does this work?
Yes.
Thank you, Jan, and of course a big thank you to IMO, IRENA, and UNCTAD for gathering your excellencies, esteemed colleagues, and climate leaders together today. Intercontinental Energy, not everyone may know it, you probably have heard the words, but we actually are one of the largest developers, investors, and owners of renewable hydrogen projects in the coastal deserts of APAC and the Middle East, totaling up to 200 gigawatts of upstream wind and solar, which can produce 80 million tons per annum of green ammonia, zero emissions ammonia. BP is our operating partner on one project in Western Australia, and Shell is the same for a project in Oman. There are many willing markets for zero-emission fuels like hydrogen and ammonia. From e-kerosene to aviation to green steel, there's growing demand from a variety of sectors. However, we are as motivated by the environment as helping to usher in a just transition. We are attracted to shipping because we see, as Joanna referred to earlier, a shipping industry that is leading and dedicated and meaningful, and with the unique position of IMO as the single regulator of the shipping industry with 175 member states, most of whom are considered Global South, and certainly we're not responsible for the climate crisis we find ourselves in today. We truly believe that we can make everyone a winner with green growth. Having surveyed the world for green resources, supply chain manufacturing, markets, we see a pathway for most, if not all of these countries to take part in the hydrogen economy and to benefit from ambitious shipping regulations. Many global south countries have wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, and land. Many others have quite competent and can grow in their capabilities to produce supply chain elements like PV or electrolyzers. We are very excited about helping to build more complex, sustainable economies across the world. We were also extremely heartened by the ambitious results of MEPC 80, and we are supportive of the comprehensive impact assessment. We stand ready to help, to work together, to get creative, and make this a win for everyone. To repeat an earlier speaker, we are in a race against time, and we must hit these timing targets.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Alicia. I have a couple of questions here that are about, like, by when do you think this and that will happen? Now, I'm an economist, and my answer is always, it depends. No?
That's why science.
So you prefer the question by when, without the it depends. So a date. By when do you believe renewable hydrogen production projects around the world are ready to supply the global shipping industry to ensure achieving the IMO target?
Well, I think everyone is aware, and I've ad nauseum seen a lot of different projections about how there have been a huge number of announcements and only 10% FIDs. I think people need to understand the way that major projects work and understand that you would not want somebody to build a project in 1.5 years, because we have EPA, we have economic assessments, we have socioeconomic impacts, we have environmental assessments. Obviously, we would not want these projects to actually harm the environment. So things take time. You know, you do have to do feasibility, you have to do pre-feed, you have to do feed. So things take a bit of time. I mean, FIDs for our projects are only going to start in, say, 2025. And, you know, then you have to actually construct, and you're not throwing up 25 gigawatts a year. It's, you know, it's going to take, for these major projects, 10 years to get to that final stage. But you will be producing and selling from the first year. So you'll just be increasing the capacity. There are a number of projects. I think that we will be able to create enough to hit 2030, but we will really have a large enough amount in the 2030s. I mean, to really hit the 2040 target. I think getting to 2030 is going to be hard, but we're going to do it. And we're going to have to use a lot of different fuels and solutions that, you know, I myself might not be a big fan of, but we pretty much need everything we can get. And there are a number of other options. You know, obviously there are biofuels, there's methanol, there's a number of different things that we don't personally work on, but will be necessary to get us to that 2030 target. But in essence, I think if you just look at ammonia, and I don't mean to just focus on that, but it is special. It is highly scalable. If you want to make ammonia, all you need is the wind, the sun, nitrogen, which is 80% of our atmosphere already, and seawater. That's it. We will never run out of the capability to make ammonia. So it is just the most scalable you know, zero emissions option for shipping.
Okay, thank you very much. Last but not least, Sam Ugur, Director Group Shipping, Tata Steel, your expectations, please.
Well, first of all, am I audible? Okay. So, hi, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for the opportunity. I'm really glad to be here with so many expert policymakers, regulators. So I think I'll help you on the timing, because most of the items I wanted to say in my remarks has already been discussed. So instead, I'll do something a little bit different. So I'd like to give a little picture of our journey on sustainability, what we have done. So we started around 2 years ago with 2 of us in the organization. I'm talking about the maritime sustainability, of course, not for the whole Tata Steel Group. With just a phone call, saying that today we have to start doing something, and what are we going to do? Imagine that actually we talk with our children, nephews, they challenge us. So we said, okay, we really have to do something. So we started our journey, and that journey developed to hold my team now, which I have approximately 30 people, incredibly talented team. All of them became a member of the sustainability, and today they all work very hard to change the world. They have fire in their belly to make something different. I think around 24 projects that I can say. We started looking into what we're going to do. We have to learn, collect the data. We have to understand where we are first so we understand the dynamics, what we are going to deal with. As the time approached, we came to the realization, actually, there was very limited options for us to do something. Biofuels was one of them, which we totally embraced it. Voyage optimization was one of them. Some operational efficiencies were there as well. So after a year, we could have actually reduced by 10% with doing this minor little adjustments. So that was a momentary moment for us that we were very proud. But is it enough? Absolutely not. We have implemented new policies on GHG, the way that we fix vessels, which I believe we are the only charterer who does it in the world today. That we limited to A to D, now it's going to go to A to C. Yeah, absolutely. So we introduced these policies, and year on year we still can reduce approximately 10%, which is wonderful. A little bit more? Is it better now? Yes. Excellent, thank you for that. But today we sit in a pivotal moment in our lives that we know that actually change has to happen. So first I'd like to turn to IMO and thank you for the GHG emission strategy that came up. I think it was a very important step for the acknowledgement that actually a change is coming. I think the industry has learned that. I think the regulatory bodies understand it today as well, and the policymakers do understand as well. So we are incredibly grateful for that, and we like to work with them as well. We are in the support of a global levy. I think for the Marshall Islands, I like to thank for that speech. It was really touching and at the heart. We fully support that because what we have seen today is actually the change, the transmission to alternative fuels. Although alternative fuels in the last 6 months, it really escalated quite a lot. So I see really a lot of improvement. But the technology part, we don't see much happening. So we believe that actually, and when I talk to most of the ship owners, the response that I receive is, well, there is no regulation for us or there is no policy for us to dive into it. So it's all commercial, there is going to be a cost is going to be paid. We know there is going to be a cost for it, and we have to bear the cost, all of us. And this is part of the just transition that we have to focus on. The policymakers have to focus on, the regulators have to focus on. And it's not only just, of course, we have to think about the economies, who's going to get affected with a levy like that. So we support these things, but we invite the policymakers and the regulators to come and sit with us. Let us be part of that journey, let us be with you in that journey, and then let us build together so that we actually know that it is just, it is shared among everybody. So this is how we look at into the policies, and we welcome, and actually we like to work with IMO as well for the revision policies as well, be part of it, and give an insight from our side how we're going to help. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. And looking at timing, I will spare you the last question because we have to go to the concluding mark. But thank you very much. Can we give an applause to all the panelists? And then, thank you.
I'll make it short for you.
Very much, Jan, and thank you very much to all panelists, but Alicia, Christophe, for your insights. Again, I think a good way to end this panel and to come to the closure of this event. Solutions are in sight, and I think that's what we need in order to bring the regulatory discussions continuing in the IMO in March next year to a successful progress. So Arsenio, up to you to wrap up this discussion in 2 minutes.
Thank you, Roland. Yes, I think we're going to be kindly asked to vacate the room very quickly afterwards. Let me start by thanking all the speakers for the very insightful interventions today. And of course, in the conversations, you all very much welcomed the 2023 IMO strategy. You all wanted that certainty, and that's what the organization has given to all. We underlined the urgency on developing the next set of measures, the operational and technical measures. And of course, also the emission pricing mechanism. You have heard different views on the pricing mechanism. You heard the word taxing, levy, ETS. We have several organizations. One of the beauties of IMO is that we take every single comment on board. We bring all the parties together, so all the stakeholders, and that's when we make the decisions. And what we're actually carrying out right now is that very important assessment to avoid any negative impact on trade, on developing countries, in particular on the States. We're not going to make these decisions lightly. We know where all the countries are coming from. We know their positions, but the organization will continue to strive to make the right decisions based on the information that is provided to us. And of course, I want to thank UNCTAD, and I know, Jean, that we're going to be putting a lot of pressure on you. I'm not going to apologize for that, because you also have said that we are all in this together, and we need to continue to working towards finding out the solutions. 2030 is doable, yes, with challenges, but this is the reason why we started with at least 5% of renewable fuels by 2030. Green corridors are practical measures that the member states are already introducing. That is going to bring valuable input to the decision-making process at IMO. And of course, is keeping that commitment that we all have in putting in place the global rules that is going to continue to carry this global industry to be sustainable and strive for the future. The word balance was mentioned a couple of times, and I took notes of it because that's what we are all about. We need to take a balanced approach. We need to recognize the challenges that some countries, in particularly smaller developing states and least developing countries have, and how we're going to support that transition. Because whenever we refer to just an equitable transition, we all know what it means, but it's putting the pieces into the right place in order to actually take us all there. So with all that, I really appreciate the input because it is very valuable information for us. I welcome you to continue to be engaged and involved with the process at the organizations. And I would like to thank once again UNCTAD and IRENA for joining us for the second COP in a row, and hopefully we will do it again next year. Thank you all for being with us this afternoon.